How are you doing? How are things there?
I'm okay, thanks. I'm sorry I couldn't come last week. I just did so much on Facebook. I
Yeah,
was just wiped out.
yeah.
Um,
We're all overwhelmed. I mean, everything has been just so
yeah.
overwhelming at this point. I um, I'm glad you're okay though. So how are things going in England? I saw there was some awesome demonstrations.
There have been, there have been. I went to a really, really good one here in Brighton. I think I mean, I thought there 300 people, and then someone said maybe there's 400 people, which is a lot for Brighton.
It's great, yeah.
And then obviously there was, some people say 200,000 in London yesterday.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well,
I think,
we have good news. I think there's been a real shift in opinion. We've had the New York Times. Hi, how are you, Mohammed? How are you? Good to see you. Um, um,
hello.
he's been very involved in the issue from Tigray. He's from
Okay.
Ethiopia, and he's been keeping us. Oh no, that's Richard. Oh, it's Richard Perone. Hey, hi, Richard.
Oh, it's Richard. Okay, it says admin, so I wasn't, yeah.
And he's in Lebanon. He's in
Oh, you're in
Lebanon.
Lebanon. Hi.
Yeah, hi, Richard. So nice to
Assalamu
see you.
alaikum.
Yeah,
Alaikum salam.
great. So good to see everybody. Yeah, I was shocked. I got up this morning, got my coffee, picked up the New York Times outside my door, and I was shocked. I thought I was still asleep and dreaming. There was a huge article on the front. Thank you, Richard. Thank you. Send it to BB. Send one to BB. There was a huge article in the New York Times about the difficulty of living under occupation. And it was very accurate and very balanced. And it talked about the indignities that the Palestinians suffer all the time. And Richard and I, and when we've traveled there, we've seen all this.
Yeah.
And I've always been amazed that the Palestinians are as calm as they are, considering what they go through. And I was really shocked to see the New York Times writing a very fair, balanced, pro-Palestinian article. It was really wonderful to see. Hi, Norby. How are you? So anyhow, let's start our meeting while we're waiting for a few other people. I have since everybody's celebrating, I think we need to celebrate. And we will play some Dopka music to get us in the mood, to liven up things. Let's go. Hi, Brooklyn for peace. Welcome, Tom. Hey, Frank, welcome.
I got something to say.
Okay, welcome everybody. I think that everybody, we have 6 of us here. Frank, Brooklyn for Peace. I think that's Tom Cox. We've been having very interesting online controversies between members of Brooklyn for Peace who are having trouble being peaceful with each other. The left always goes after each other. This is the problem, right? They're always in total solidarity. And the left spend a lot of time fighting with each other. Hey, Charlotte. Oh, it's Charlotte, not Tom.
Hi.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, peace. Yes.
Hi.
We need that peace in Brooklyn for peace.
Yeah.
We have some people who are causing some controversy, but the left always is problematic on agreeing, and sometimes the peacemakers have problems being peaceful among themselves. But anyhow, so As I opened up, I said I was shocked. I don't know, Frank, if you saw today's New York Times. I was in total shock. Big article on the pain of living under occupation. I couldn't believe it on the front page of the New York Times. And a very accurate, fair, balanced description of all the things that drove me crazy when I was there, and you and Frank and all of us who've been there, most of us have been there. Um, and I was always surprised the Palestinians were as calm as they were because the indignities are so horrific. And it started out with the guy in East Jerusalem near Mount of Olives, between Mount of Olives and Jerusalem, who's having his house chopped down. And the tragedy of the whole thing, it just, and so it described a lot of the plight of the homeowners having their homes developed. It also described the plight of the workers who have to travel from Palestine through the long routes, which can take a ride that should be 45 minutes. It can take them 33 hours, plus whatever garbage goes on at the checkpoints. So it was a very good article on the front page. I was in shock. But there was a good article on um, the Electronic Intifada, and I wanted to share some of the stuff. So, as from the Electronic Intifada. So here's some pictures of this last week of the devastation, of the death, everything that's gone on. They bombed. I read there's 17 hospitals in Gaza have been damaged. 17 hospitals, plus the only COVID testing center site they have. So, what now we have a ceasefire. Is this hopeful or not? They've stopped throwing bombs. By the way, I was wondering how did Hamas, under the blockade, get all the materials to build the bombs? Does anybody know?
Iran has been funding a lot of this. I'm not sure how to get
Okay.
the materials inside.
All right, let me tell you now.
That, yeah.
They used the bombs that Israel dropped. They used the remnant of the bombs that Israel dropped in the last war, collected all the metal, and used it to build their rockets.
Oh,
Talk about karma.
yeah.
I thought that was hysterical because I was wondering how the hell did they get under the blockade?
But they had such powerful ones this time. They must be making them to a different sort of model because I think the first night I was like, I'd never seen that kind of footage of the rockets getting to Tel Aviv, the kind of firestorm over Tel Aviv.
Not far.
So it seemed to me like I don't know if they were spending more money as well on.
Well, I'm sure Iran is shipping in a lot, but actually, a lot of the bombs were made from the materials that Israel has dropped.
Yeah, well,
Previously. And hi, Mary. Welcome, Mary. Um, so I think this is extremely interesting. Talk about recycling and karma. The Hamas is very good at recycling, baby. I think that's hysterical. So I just wanted to read an article that I think maybe helps us put a little bit into perspective because we can get euphoric and we think, oh, there's a ceasefire, everything is going to be fine. Well, let's see if that's true. Here's the article: ceasefire puts no end to Israeli repression. And here, right on the Electronic Intifada, and Frank, Norby, Richard, and myself, all of us who've been to Palestine, we've seen this 1,000 times. Here's Israeli forces detaining Palestinians following a demonstration celebrating the Gaza ceasefire in the West Bank city of Tubas. You can't drive on the roads in Palestine without seeing the IDF or the police pulling over Palestinians, and you're always holding your breath that they're not going to pull you over. So let's see what this was written by Maureen Claire Murphy, who's very, very good. She's associate editor of Electronic Intifada. What does she have to say about this? And and I guess you've all seen the news that the Israeli police attacked Palestinians at Jerusalem's Al-Aqsa Mosque compound on Friday, mere hours after a ceasefire halted hostilities in Gaza and Israel. Police fired stun grenades and tear gas, and Palestinians hurled rocks after hundreds took part in a celebratory demonstration in which they waved Palestinian and Hamas flags, Al Jazeera reported. Um, and here you can watch as the Palestinian, as the Israelis storm Al-Aqsa Mosque. I thought, what are they thinking? They just had a huge war, and they're doing the same thing. That
No, but
provoked the war.
this is a strategy that started a long time ago. There were 4 years ago, remember when the Israeli police stormed and occupied Al-Aqsa and then put in metal detectors?
That's
Remember
right.
that?
Right. I was
Well,
there.
I was there
Yeah,
to protest that. We were outside praying for 5 days, and with all the international pressure and us protesting, they finally let us into Al-Aqsa area. They took out the metal detectors and the cameras. But when we arrived to pray, and we were all there peacefully, we were met by a whole line of Israeli police that attacked us, and we had this big fight. I ended up in the hospital again. But you know what? I was told that they were upset. The Israeli government was upset that we won this round and that we actually were able to pressure Israel to kick out the metal detectors and also the cameras. So I'm thinking here, Israel is not content about the results so far of the war, even though it says it is. It was not able to neutralize Hamas and also neutralize the protests in the West Bank. And so I think this could be I haven't seen this in the news, but this could be just another of their strategies of revenge. Let's, okay, we can't take it out on Gaza now, so let's dump on the Palestinians in Al-Aqsa and try to provoke something so that they can get back to bombing again.
Yeah.
Something like
Here's
that.
a video showing the actual storming, the police going in, storming the mosque.
Oh,
It's just disgusting. When they did the thing with the medical detectors, I was there trying to get in from Jordan, and I got trapped in the service trying to get in. So here they're doing the same shit, arresting people, harassing them at the mosque. I
This
think
government this government has become vengeful, spiteful. It's we're the chosen few. You dare fight up against us. You dare protest. You dare even say that we should revolt and kick out Abu Mazen, who is our collaborator. You dare doing this. And so it's very vengeful, and we see what's happening today. By the way, I wanted to add something about the arms. It's not just recuperating the bombs that Hamas has cleverly done. Iran has funded a lot of this stuff, and the Coronet bombs that actually are guided missiles, they got basically from Iran in pieces. I don't know how they get it, but they put it together. They don't put together their bombs only from leftovers from Israeli bombs. I wanted to just add that.
I'm sure it's not only that, but I just got a flash breaking news from Haaretz saying that there was an explosion in Iran at a drone factory. And some of the drones evidently were marked Gaza for Gaza. So
okay.
actually 9 people were killed. So it was a big explosion.
Oh, God.
So anyhow, despite all this crap, the Palestinians were celebrating. Soldiers there are not happy. Not happy. So the celebrating of the Palestinians is driving the IDF and the Israelis, and they're setting off fireworks in Jerusalem, celebrating fireworks. honking horns, as you can hear, honking. So I'm sure this is driving the Israelis nuts. I mean, they want.
Hey, can I say something?
Yeah, sure.
One big problem with the Israeli is that they follow the shit book called the Talmud. And the Talmud teaches them, if you're not a Jew, you are an animal. I heard that from a Israeli soldier at checkpoint, that just like Hitler looking at Hundermensch, they see anyone who's not a Jew is an animal. So killing a cow, killing a Palestinian, no problem, man, no problem. That's one of the big problem, is the view that anybody who is not a Jew is an animal, that I'm an animal and anybody else is an animal. So how can you discuss that?
Well, that's not all Jews. I mean, that's a radical segment of Jews, and we know that's in Judaism, but we also know that Jews have been responsible for humane ethics. If you read the Bible, you're supposed to treat the stranger, foreigner with dignity and respect.
I agree with that. That's the second point I have.
The Bible has a different take, and Jews have led the world in look at the civil rights movement. Look at the rights for human rights movement. So we've always been led by Jews. So there's a big contradiction within Judaism, as in within Christianity.
Yeah, you can always take the holy books literally, and you can always have a fundamentalist view, whether it's the Bible or the Quran or the Talmud. But you know, we can see that in interfaith work that there are so many people who see the essence of the religions, which is actually all. I think about. Well, there's different stress, but in Quran is mercy. It's always about mercy, isn't it? And in the Bible as well, the Christianity is mercy. In the Jewish tradition, they have the tradition of atonement, where you beg forgiveness and you make good. So I think that there are very strong humanist ethics, really, that the great religions teach us.
The problem is, I think Israel has encouraged the far-right extremism in their education. I've personally spoken, when I've traveled across into Israel and Palestine and heard what was taught in the Israeli schools, and there is that element, Richard. You're quite right that it's okay to kill off the goyim. Actually, when we were Zoom bombed, I remember last month. Those of you who were on, one of the lunatics that came on was telling us all, you goyim, we're going to turn you into our slaves. You will eventually, the goyim will become Jewish slaves. So there is that element. And there's
that element on all sides, isn't there? I mean, the far right Christians think that they're going to get to go up in the rapture and we're all going to go to hell. Actually, the Hamas charter, which I know it's retired now, but it is anti-Semitic. So,
can I say Semitic?
Yeah.
Before I go on, give me 1 minute here. Israel claims that God gave them that land. Okay, he also gave them the 10 commandments. It's not 10 suggestions, which is to not to lie, steal, cheat, and kill. You forget that second part, right? God gave us that land. God gave us. What about the 10 commandments? True. What 10
this is the thing. It's always cherry picking, to suit a political agenda, and you ignore the parts of the holy text that don't fit that, because holy texts are actually very complicated.
Point 2, please. What is a Semite? What is a Semite? A Semite is from Shem, the first son of Abraham. That means Iraqis, Syrians, Lebanese, Jordan, Palestinian are Semite. When you say anything against us Lebanese, you're an anti-Semite. So it's not just, you're against the Jews. No. Semite is also Palestinian.
I think that is very important to stress, because the thing is, when you think about it, really it was a place where actually everyone lived together,
Right. All right, let's go on and see what's going to happen. So she mentions that Israeli aggression against worshippers at Al-Aqsa Mosque was the spark that ignited the Gaza escalation nearly 2 weeks earlier. But like Friday's violence, the assault came after Palestinians celebrated a humiliating Israeli setback, this time in Jerusalem, which remember was the cancellation of that annual march of extremist Jewish settlers under the banner of Jerusalem Day. So that's one of the things that pissed off the far right, and that's why. So the Palestinians were celebrating then. The Israeli police laid siege to and attacked the Alaska Mosque while it was filled with Ramadan worshippers on May 10th, injuring thousands. And there were many assaults in the previous days. Hamas launched rockets from Gaza after Gaza failed to respond to an ultimatum to withdraw its forces from Alaska and the occupied East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah and free detainees. So I think this, Frank, this goes along with what you were saying. The whole thing was planned, you know, because Hamas said they would, they gave them an ultimatum. They said withdraw forces from the mosque and from Sheikh Jarrah, and none of this would have happened. But Netanyahu wanted this.
You could say this is a provocation in a way, but sending troops back into Al-Aqsa, you know, they're all there to pray and to seek thankfulness and forgiveness and so forth in the Al-Aqsa Mosque. Sending the soldiers in for what we said before and the police, it might be considered a provocation. I don't think Israel likes this truce, but they were kind of coerced into doing it, and Biden got involved and so forth. It looks good anyway, but I think they want to get back to bombing Gaza.
Yeah, absolutely. So and interesting, the same day that Hamas launched the rockets, the Israeli High Court postponed a hearing on the forced expulsion of 8 Palestinian families from the homes in which they've lived for decades in the Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah to make way for Jewish settlers. And she writes, the evictions are an illegal application of Israel's discriminatory domestic law to occupied territory, according to Adamir, a Palestinian human rights group. And Adamir works with prisoners, and they're going to come and do an interview with us in a couple of weeks. So I'll keep you posted. In the preceding 3 weeks of the start of Ramadan, now this is interesting, I didn't know this, Israeli forces cut wires to speakers broadcasting the call to prayer from Alaska Mosque. Now, I didn't know that. This is very provocative, according to Adamir. Authorities also, and this is again provocative, put barriers around Damascus Gate to Jerusalem's old city, assaulting Palestinians and preventing their assembly. That's another big no-no, because Damascus Gate is the primary entrance into Old Jerusalem and the Palestinian quarter. This is so provocative, and it's right across the bus station where everybody gets their buses to go up to Palestine. And then on top of it, further provocation was incited by Israeli settlers the evening of 22nd of April, who roamed the streets chanting death to the Arabs and targeting Palestinian civilians. So the worst episode of violence since 2014 was set in motion. More than 240 lives were lost in Gaza, 12 in Israel, thousands were injured, and the infrastructure in Gaza was broadly destroyed.
Jackie, I think before we go on, I think we should talk about what's happened in Gaza. I mean, there was a recent interview by a pilot. I'm not sure if this has been confirmed, who was asked anonymously, why did the Israeli Air Force target the towers, residential towers? The response was they were so frustrated because they could not bomb some of the Hamas headquarters and so forth that they decided to take it out on the citizens as a deterrent also for any more Hamas actions. And yet targeting residential towers, there were 5 to 7 just residential towers clearly targeted and destroyed by the Israeli Air Force with people inside, and sometimes they were able to notify the people ahead of time, which is clearly a war crime. And then Biden gets involved and says, well, I'm going to pressure Israel, right, to do the truce. But then he can't stop but say, but Israel has the right to defend itself, and we still are in favor of the two-state solution, where there is or we're at least in favor of the Jewish state, the keeping the Jewish state, which clearly ignores all the non-Jews in Israel today. So these things are coming to the fray here. and it's very serious war crimes. And by he's doing the same thing that Obama did in 2014, in the middle of this lamentation of, oh my God, all this civilians' death and women and children and houses, things have been targeted that should not be targeted. He's now at the point of approving the $700 million worth of arms to be sent to Israel upon its request for ammunition to continue killing Gazans. And, you know, we have those bills that have been submitted by AOC and Madam Tlaib and then Bernie Sanders. I don't know if they're going to succeed, but this is clearly, and I did all I can to call all the congressmen I could, left them messages, sent them emails saying, you can add this, you can use my name if you want. I am added Obama on the complaint because of what he did. By 3 days after lamenting Obama in 2014 of the death of all these civilians, he approved these ammunitions to be sent to Israel, over $1 million worth of ammunition at the request of Israel to refurbish its supplies and tank ammunition, which is clearly aiding and abetting a war criminal. And Biden seems to be at the brink of doing the same thing, which is going to make me add him. I wasn't going to add him the complaint because he is sending money to Palestine. He's doing a lot more. He's opening up money for the UN. But since he's going to approve apparently the sales of arms right in the middle of this massacre, I'm going to have to add him to the complaint for war crimes as an accessory to Netanyahu's war crimes.
Frank, I have another information for you about the war crimes. I'm not sure if you heard this. People, you know, entire families were destroyed homes that had grandparents, uncles, aunts, young children, entire extended families were deliberately targeted. And when Amy Goodman had this on the other night, and my friend who was Jewish, Flo, she said, oh, that's propaganda. But then what it turns out is Israel has all the people in Gaza have to keep Israel updated every day on who's living in what house. So they know the homes that have these large extended families. They have them all on record. And they went on a deliberate campaign of bombing, I forget how many of these houses, a number of them, I think like 8, 10 of them, houses that had these large extended families. So the entire family is wiped out. And this was a deliberate strategy on the part of Israel because they knew exactly who they were targeting. They have all those records of who lives where. So this to me is another really horrendous war crime, deliberately targeting and exterminating families. They always say
the United Nations cannot do anything. It's a paper tiger, okay? They don't give a shit. Israeli don't give a shit what the world says. They just do what they want to do. And a story. Don't like it, too fucking bad. Unfortunately, that's the case right now. But God has a plan for that. Sorry.
Well, I think that this International Criminal Court is making people very nervous. You know, it's making Zionists in Britain very nervous. Definitely. It's on the news. I saw the Palestinian ambassador, Hussam Zomlot, talking very strongly about it.
It was very good.
Boris Johnson has criticized it very recently, saying that we can't send Israel to the International Court because they're our friend and ally. Like, it's just as blatant as you like, you know. that's for other countries. That's not for our friends. And there is, of course, this sort of argument
that down together too.
But you know, so I've been all through this. I've been just trying to get all the details, you know, maybe even things that you've told us, Frank, but I just didn't really clock, you know. But it doesn't matter that Israel isn't a signatory. What matters is that the Palestinians are a state or have a claim to be a state.
No, it hasn't a claim. Right? It's clearly been decided that Palestine is a state, and it's a member of the ICC, and the crimes were committed in Palestine. That's enough to give to give the ICC a jurisdiction over Israel and Palestine.
And when
the ICC will be able to stop that?
Sorry,
but I don't see it. You see, ICC will be able to stop the massacres and the killing of Israel, Are you dreaming or
Well, I
what?
didn't say that. They're
Oh,
working on a
sorry.
judgment. It's all about deterrence. You're right. Israel, even today, it doesn't seem like it's terribly deterred by what the monster. But Netanyahu has turned into a monster government. They don't care, just like you said, just like the Nazis. They figured they're untouchable with impunity. But to have a war crime condemnation against a Jew, which is the same condemnation, same judgment against the Nazis, it might give rise to them being deterred. But right now, it doesn't seem like they're terribly deterred by the ICC.
Well,
It's
the
got to
ICC
work on deterring its supporters. It's got to work on deterring the the UK from continuing to send arms there. In terms of
Exactly.
arms embargoes, and
and
Norway's just today. Norway divested from 2 firms that are engaged in human rights violations, and they more and more of BDS working.
And deter the U.S. as well, because if now that I'm trying to make it public, I've even contacted AOC and these Congress people that I am going to add Biden on the complaint if he pursues this. It might deter the Americans to a degree that we also are condemned as accomplice, because the United States is not a member of the ICC. But again, if we are an accomplice to a country that is violating international law, is a war criminal, then we could be hauled in under the jurisdiction of the ICC as well. So you're absolutely right. This is deterrent.
The adjective friends of Israel that Boris Johnson mentioned to accomplices of Israel. That's really what is going on. All right, let's see what the numbers are. Nearly 2,000 people were injured, many requiring extensive surgery and rehabilitation. The UK charity Medical Aid for Palestinians notice. But the added mental health impact is immense, particularly for a population already traumatized by repeated military offenses and 14 years of illegal closure and blockade. 2 doctors and a psychologist were among those killed in Gaza. Both the World Health Organization and the Red Cross urgently call for medical supplies where the healthcare sector is on the verge of collapse. The director of the International Committee of the Red Cross says it will take years to rebuild, and even more to rebuild the fractured lives.
Have you stated the people that were killed? There were over 200 people that were killed, including those families and so forth. I don't see that here somewhere, but that's amazing.
We just read that. That was read above.
Oh, well, that was read before.
Yeah, it's in 67 children.
Palestinian authorities in Gaza said the Israeli strikes caused 40 million in damage to factories and industries, and 22 million in damage to the energy sector. Israeli attacks caused 27 million in damages to greenhouses, agricultural lands, and poultry farms. The Gaza ministry said. So this is a slaughter. This is slaughter.
But Biden says that it's going to help. The United States is going to help rebuild Gaza, but it's okay. Israel has the right to defend itself. See, that's another lie and misleading, and also accessory to a crime that Obama did. He knows clearly that the reaction to an attack that's disproportionate to the attack is not protected under the right of self-defense.
Yeah.
The whole language was not self-defense. The language was they're going to pay dearly. That's the language of vengeance.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely.
Yeah, what's interesting here is the schools, although people fled to the schools for protection, the 250 buildings damaged, 770 units damaged, that they found in UNRWA, it found 2 deeply buried bombs in one of its Gaza schools. So they bombed the schools as well. And they estimate there's several hundred pieces of unexploded ordnance in Gaza, so that these bombs are going to prove dangerous for years and years. The checkpoints to entry to Gaza Strip remain closed. One was open for a few hours to allow humanitarian aid and animal feed. And UNRWA's launched an appeal for $38 million in funding to respond to the urgent needs. So today they have 7 hours of electricity per day. Israel's preventing the delivery of fuel to the only power plant. So the desalinization plants can't work. Sewage treatment can't work. 800,000 people lacking regular access to water. So we have an ongoing situation, which is just horrific. The rebuilding sounds comfortable. The thing is with Biden's, he said he's only going to rebuild with Palestinian Authority, not with Hamas.
That's right. Yeah.
Well, what does that mean? Because Palestinian Authority doesn't have authority in Gaza.
Exactly. It's really it's speaking with a forked tongue, and it's all political stuff.
Well, that just means he's never going to do it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay.
That's the way to set up for failure. That's setting it up for failure right there.
Yeah. So this is a very good podcast that I thought I'd share with you on how the Palestinian resistance defeated Israel. Because Israel did really suffer a humiliating defeat. So let's listen to this for a little bit, and we'll pause it and comment on what it
to build
what it says.
very significant underground structures.
Oops.
I didn't get that. Could you try again?
My stupid computer.
The Electronic Intifada.
The Electronic Intifada.
This is the Electronic Intifada podcast. I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman.
And I'm Asa Winstanley.
I'm Nora Barrows-Friedman with Asa and Stanley, and this is the Electronic Intifada podcast. We are gathered today to talk about what's been happening the last few days on the ground in Gaza, the West Bank, and historic Palestine. Today, we're recording on May 20th, and we're joined by Ali Abunimah, our executive director, and John Elmer, who's a researcher and my co-host at the Brief podcast. John and Ali, thanks for being with us today.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for having me back, Nora.
Ali, let's begin with you. Let's talk about the last few days, the last few nights of attacks. Over 230 Palestinians have been killed. Hundreds of airstrikes by Israel. Give us your sense of what's been happening, and just your observations of the last few days.
Yeah, well, as we're speaking, there's a report that a ceasefire is imminent, perhaps within a day or within hours or 2 days. I think it can't come soon enough for people in Gaza who have been under horrific bombardment for now 10 days. A bombardment which has specifically targeted civilians. There have been massacres, as we reported at the Electronic Intifada. 14 families have been essentially wiped out in Gaza. The vast majority of the dead are civilians, and more than 1,700 people have been injured. And there has been systematic Israeli targeting of civilian infrastructure, high-rise residential buildings, private homes, businesses, banks, clinics, just, everything that is essential to life. And that is not an accident. That is not so-called collateral damage. It is the Israeli strategy, the so-called Dahia doctrine that they developed or first rolled out, let's say, on Lebanon in 2006, when they deliberately destroyed the southern suburb of Beirut. And the logic is that, we're going to inflict so much pain and suffering on the
I can't hear
Jackie,
it.
can you put your
cause. I think cruelty has always been the kind of doctrine of Zionism. The Iron Wall, as Jabotinsky, the spiritual father of the Likud party and of Benjamin Netanyahu's ideology and of Zionism generally. You have to be cruel enough to the Arabs that they understand that there's no point fighting against the Zionist state. But also, I think it's because there are really no so-called military targets in Gaza. This is an asymmetrical conflict or battle. We're talking about a 21st century military armed by the United States and the European Union on the one hand, and basically a guerrilla army, a resistance movement on the other hand, that doesn't have big stationary military targets, that doesn't have big military bases or, you know, columns of tanks or warplanes. So that's why Israel, its only strategy to try to sear into the consciousness of Palestinians that there's no point resisting is to attack the civilian population, just as the United States did in the Vietnam War, just as you know, all colonial regimes do. You inflict suffering on the population in the hope of demoralizing them and getting them to turn away from resistance. Now, what I want to say about the ceasefire, if and when it comes, is that what's significant is it will come with Israel having achieved nothing except death and destruction. As I always say, if winning a war means killing, you know, massacring men, women, and children, then Israel is always the winner and always the world champion. But if it means changing the strategic equation, if it means increasing the legitimacy of Zionism, if it means defeating Palestinian resistance and making Palestinians kneel and accept that they just have to live under Zionist rule, then Israel is always the loser and it has lost again. And the final sort of opening observation I'll make is that I think the Palestinian cause emerges from this horror, and it is horror, first of all, having paid a terribly high price in civilian lives, but one that clearly Palestinians in Palestine were willing to pay, in the sense that any colonized people, you know, if you look at Algeria, 1.5 million people died in that war to free the country from French rule, because once a colonized, occupied people makes a decision to free itself, that decision is really irrevocable, and they are prepared to pay a high price. And what we've seen here is that we also emerge with Palestinian consciousness enhanced, pan-Palestinian consciousness across historic Palestine. This is the first time in decades, or perhaps ever, that Israel is, in a sense, forced to confront Palestinians on 3 fronts at the same time. Palestinians in Gaza resisting militarily, Palestinians in the West Bank resisting against occupation forces, and Palestinians across Israel within you know, the 1948 boundaries of Israel resisting against the racist state like never before. And the Israeli strategy for controlling the Palestinians has always been based on the colonial tactic of divide and rule, fragmentation. If Israel can deal with Gaza by itself, it can deal with the West Bank by itself, it can perhaps deal with the Palestinians within Israel by itself, but I think it's a significant change in the strategic equation if all Palestinians across Palestine are in revolt and in active resistance at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, the mayor, the Israeli mayor of Lid, called for he basically said it was a national emergency and insisted that Netanyahu bring the military forces in to the city to quell Palestinian uprising. I mean, has this, I mean, this is really Israel's worst nightmare in many ways. And it doesn't seem like the resistance is being quelled.
Well, Israel made a strategic miscalculation, and this is against, you know, let's look at the regional political context. Less than a year ago, there was really a triumphalist tone in Israel and its allies in the region and the United States that the Palestinian cause was dead, that the Palestinian people were isolated, that it was a losing struggle, and that Israel had succeeded in imposing a reality on the Palestinians that they could do nothing about. And that's why we saw Arab regimes like the United Arab Emirates and Bahrain and Morocco coming out into the open with their long-standing relationships with Israel and signing the so-called Abraham Accords. And of course, all that was backed more or less openly by Saudi Arabia. And really the only question was, when will Saudi Arabia officially join the party? You know, is it going to be, you know, right away or, you know, in 6 months' time? So there was this air of triumphalism, and they celebrated their marriage to Israel over what they all thought was the dead body of the Palestinian cause. So this revolt, this uprising, this resistance is really a rude awakening for Israel, the United States, and its clients in the region. And it really does change the strategic equation on a number of levels. And I think it deals a severe blow to the trend of normalization. It reestablishes the Palestinian cause as really the central cause in the region. And it explodes the fantasy that I think many of the Arab regimes, but also the Americans, Europeans, and Israelis had, that the Palestinians can just be dealt with by so-called conflict management, a little bit of economic aid and string them along with a fake peace process, but they really can't upset the strategic equation, which was about creating a American-backed regional alliance to confront Iran and to, you know, destroy any states in the region that could resist, you know, U.S.-Israeli hegemony. And I think that we are really dealing with a new situation.
All right, what do you think?
Pretty hopeful, isn't it? I mean, I think it seems to resonate with, you know, what I think a lot of other people are saying and what we can all observe happened.
Yeah.
My worry would be that it would all kind of subside, you know, because people are physically fragmented, you know, they are not able to come together physically. But yeah, I think there definitely has been, to me, it feels like there has been a big shift. There's been a big shift with the Palestinians coming together. I heard someone say, you know, it was the first time in decades, really, that they've been so unified. And then also we see what's happening in Congress. We see what's happening on the streets. I see more and more Jewish groups coming forward. Jewish Currents, which is a left-wing American journal, published a very detailed argument on how the right of return could play out, how it could be respected and fulfilled. And that was reprinted in The Guardian, which is not known for defending the rights of Palestinians.
Wow.
So, you know, I think there are new voices and yeah, we just have to keep intensifying. You know, certainly nothing's going to happen if we just sit back.
Well, the Palestinians historically fragmented. Israel made one big tactical error. The one thing that unites all of them, whether they're in the Gulf region, Saudi Arabia, Palestine, is Alaska Musk. And that was the big tactical error that Israel made. They thought they could get away with it, and the settlers love messing with the Temple Mount, as they call it. But that was the one unifying factor. And then they did it again, you know, so, and Jordan, you know, the king of Jordan is the protector of the holy sites. And they came very close to almost in getting involved in a war with Israel. So, but I think his comments on the cruelty of Zionism from its inception.
Can I say something?
Yeah, sure, please.
Norman Finkelstein and Noam Chomsky, I think they're Jewish, are not allowed to go to Israel, right?
Right.
So they say, oh, Israel is the only democratic country in the Middle East. Well, they forget about Lebanon. But let me throw one thing. Fatah, they could not enter into it. They couldn't infiltrate it. So they created a new gang of people that they're not too happy with Fatah, and they call it Hamas. My idea is, okay, the soldiers are totally dedicated, blah, blah, blah. But the head of Hamas, I think it smells like Jewish, so they can create some trouble. And then ask, please help us, Hamas is stealing us and we have to kill them to kill us. They need Gaza in order to get the money, and we're poor, so we're so, in need of help. If without Gaza, what would happen to Israel? They wouldn't have any way to complain. So I'm not too sure about the fact that Hamas is totally with Israel. With Palestinian.
Well, Hamas was backed by Israel because when they had that election, when they first won, because they didn't want the Palestinian Authority. Frank, you want to fill us in on that background?
Would you repeat that?
What I heard was that Hamas was actually kind of the Frankenstein created by Israel because they wanted a competitor for the Palestinian Authority. When they first had that election that Hamas won, that the Mossad actually pushed for Hamas because they didn't want the Palestinian Authority to have control.
Exactly, to counterbalance Fatah that was gaining more power in Palestine. They thought they would create, like you say, kind of like their own little monster to do that, except they didn't understand that the evolution of Hamas and the people they selected, they leaned toward an Islamist group, and then separated because and then became Hamas as it is today. Absolutely, but the thing is, they're talking about Fatah and Hamas getting together now. And when people were yelling at Al-Aqsa last Friday, or just a couple of days ago, after they were being, stormed by the Israeli police and so forth, they were still yelling, Hamas, for Hamas. In a way, and I've talked to people every day from Jerusalem, Palestinians, about this. And I said, well, what about Hamas? I mean, Fatah, Mahmoud Abbas canceled the elections recently, and he said it was because Israel has prevented the Palestinians from Jerusalem to vote. We cannot have the vote without Palestinians from Jerusalem, I think is a lie. I think Mahmoud Abbas clearly realizes that Hamas could win, and he likes the idea that I think he even was collaborated in the fact that Israel prevented the elections in Jerusalem, so that would give him an excuse to cancel the elections, which he doesn't really want to have. And that's why he hasn't had elections in 15 years. And so the problem is, I asked liberals and radicals and activists in Jerusalem, isn't it time now for Hamas to step up? The resistance, and we have a real leader that Palestinians can get behind, because it's hard for them to get behind a collaborator with Israel. And they're still skittish about it, because if Hamas took over the Islamist part, this makes things complicated. The Sharia law Islamist part, where maybe it's not going to be as rigid and radical as the Taliban in Afghanistan, but they're afraid of losing their rights under Hamas, which is an Islamist group. And unless Hamas, attenuates, moderates its position with respect to Sharia law. So this is a problem right now. And I really feel 100% that they've got to get rid of Mahmoud Abbas. He is like the Vichy government in France that collaborated with the Nazis in World War II. And he has security collaborations. He has done absolutely almost nothing during this crisis to support, he just with words, but clearly not to support the resistance, very little. And if nothing. And so he needs to get rid of him, but how can you do that without an election?
All right, let's see. Well, let's go on and listen to more of what this guy says. Maybe he'll have an answer.
Bring John into this. John, you lived in Gaza for many years during the Second Intifada, and you've been researching the equipment and technology of resistance factions, especially in Gaza. Can you give us a sense of what you've been noticing in terms of the rockets and technology and the strategy of resistance factions in Gaza?
Yeah, I mean, as far as the rockets go, there's more of them. They're going further. They're deadlier. They're being used more tactically effectively. to go around the Iron Domes. This is something that's been developing in Gaza for a long time, and it goes back to, really it goes back to the late 80s when Israel walled off the Gaza Strip in the first place during the first so-called peace process. But particularly since 2005, when the Israelis pulled out of Gaza and left Gazans with a ghetto, an unlivable ghetto, according to the United Nations, but a piece of property, a piece of land, a base of operations, and they took advantage of that and have built an indigenous production system for developing weapons. They've dedicated considerable attention to taking what for 20 years before was a series of armed groups and bringing them all under one banner in a joint operations room, not competing with each other, but working together. The 2014 war was all about Israel telling us that they had been fighting terror all these years, right? And that was the war 2014, where they said, no, we're fighting an army now. We've put together an army. Ahmed Jabri, who was the head of Qassam at the time, was assassinated just before ceasefire negotiations. Long-term ceasefire negotiations were taking place before the 2012 war. So the idea of ceasefires is, and the resistance and the ability for a ceasefire to hold, another one of the developments that's happened is that Hamas's Politburo is in control of Yahya Sinwar, who was a founding member of Hamas and was the leader of the prisoners in jail. He was released in the Shalit exchange. And he went to Gaza in 2016, I guess it was. And he ran for leadership of the Politburo in Hamas and was elected. So the leadership in Hamas is in the Gaza Strip is a Qassam-based leadership. It puts the primacy of the armed struggle in the movement in the top position of the Politburo. That's an important thing when it comes down to a ceasefire, because if we're talking about a ceasefire for like a week or two and then fighting again, if we're talking about a ceasefire that's going to hold, Israel needs to have legitimate authority, accepted authority on the ground for the Palestinians. This idea of 30 years of collaborators who have no legitimacy, who only answer to Israel, those ceasefires have no meaning. But when you have a situation with a proper military leadership that's been built since the 1980s, we only see it every 5 years or whatever when this happens. But this capacity is what forces Israel into these positions of, well, first of all, it forces them into the positions of massacres because they can't deal with the resistance face to face. So they massacre people. Like Shujaiya, right? They attempted to invade Shujaiya in 2014. They got like 100 meters, got smoked, stopped, turned around, and just laid the place to waste. So that's the dynamic that Palestinians, these massacres are punitive, and they're also a symbol that they can't get at what they're trying to strike. The last war and the period in between, we were told so much about tunnels. The tunnels, they were going to come out of the tunnels and they were going to attack Israeli settlements. The Israelis went around the entire edge of the Gaza Strip, poking holes, trying to find tunnels. There's been nothing of that this time. The anti-tank missiles have kept the Israelis away from the border where they used to be for years and years and years. We used to always see the Associated Press footage, right, with the Israelis standing beside their tanks on the border with Gaza, doing praying or sitting on the cannons. You could see tanks all around. Islamic Jihad released a video yesterday, a drone video that showed that there was nobody anywhere near the borders in Gaza. I mean, you guys covered it as well as anybody. In the great marches in Gaza, the soldiers would line up on those berms on the edge and just shoot into the ghetto, killing people. Those berms are not manned right now, and there's nobody around the border of Gaza. And that kind of situation forces Israel's hand. They don't have a way to achieve in the whatever neoliberal definitions of achieve a victory of a colonial war. And Hamas an Islamic Jihad can fire rockets for months and months and months. This is not, they're not in a rush. Obviously, the carnage in Gaza is terrible, but the carnage doesn't make people weak-kneed in Gaza. It does the exact opposite, and I think you guys have seen it all around. The unity that came from, Gaza was isolated. That was Israel's strategy: isolate Gaza. When all that stuff happened at Al-Aqsa, all the Ramadan shenanigans that Israel was pulling off, and then once they actually got violent about it, people in the West Bank, right, asked for a response, a unified response from the national movement, and they got it. And the same with 48. It's a big deal what happened in 48. The seeds of those uprisings are strategic issues for Israel. They're not things that go away with a ceasefire.
I was talking about this last night on the Five Pillars program, which is a British Muslim website. It is just a reality that the Palestinian armed resistance in the Gaza Strip, its capabilities have become increasingly sophisticated since over the years. I mean, we saw it in 2014. You read Max Blumenthal's book, 51 Day Rule, about the 2014 massacre, which to me was the definitive book about that war. And he gets into that, what exactly you were talking about there, John, that the Israelis could not invade, whereas, during the Second Intifada, they were able to invade at least parts of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, or re-invade. They weren't able to get, barely a foot into the Gaza Strip, and they just had to pull out and, as you said, just level entire neighborhoods, vindictively flatten them to the ground. So, I mean, I think, it does show that anything that the Israeli military is really skilled at doing is killing civilians. I think there are still people in the solidarity movement who talk about the rockets from Gaza being firecrackers. I just don't think it's true. I think that Palestinian resistance, and this is what we've seen in this latest Israeli aggression, is that they've been hesitating. This is why they've not been able to invade. We've seen reports. There was rumors deliberately circulated by the Israeli army to the press that they implied they'd already invaded last week. They'd already invaded the Gaza Strip, whereas they hadn't at all. And it was just disinformation.
That was supposedly a ruse to try to draw Hamas into, this underground tunnel network that the Israelis say exists near the borders, and then to try and bomb the tunnels and collapse them on top. But I just want to, say, if I can say something.
Yeah.
I don't think it's the goal of Hamas to kill Israelis. That's the propaganda element of Israel and the Western media. It is the goal of Israel to kill Palestinians, and they do it very effectively. I think it's Israel's goal to kill as many Palestinians as they can get away with. In other words, to make it look as if they're not trying to kill Palestinians while killing them, in order to exact this high price on Palestinians. But look at what Palestinian resistance groups have done this time around. Last time in 2014, it was a big deal when Israel was forced to shut down Ben Gurion Airport for a few hours or for a day. It's been shut down for a week now. It's been shut down since the beginning. World airlines have canceled their flights, and it may be because of the pandemic that that's less shocking than it would have otherwise been, because we're so used to international travel being shut down now in a way we weren't in 2014. But nonetheless, this came at a time when Israel was celebrating its vaccination campaign and re-emerging and reopening international travel and business, and it's been shut down. And that costs, an advanced economy like Israel a massive amount. I don't know what these are based on, but I've seen reports saying, it's costing Israel $1 billion a day. That doesn't seem unreasonable to me when you think of an economy like Israel's. And the other thing I just wanted to point to in response to John's observations, which I find always so fascinating and insightful, is that I think Israel's hubris in, with this kind of triumphalist feeling that the Palestinian cause is dead, was that they could accelerate the ethnic cleansing of Jerusalem and Sheikh Jarrah and Silwan and the attacks on the Al-Aqsa Mosque with total impunity, because in the Israeli mind, Jerusalem, the Palestinians in Jerusalem were isolated. That was 200,000 people who could do nothing against the Israeli state. They were cut off from the West Bank, they're cut off from Gaza, they're cut off from anyone else. And so it was a major Israeli strategic miscalculation to think that the resistance in Gaza would not dare to respond from Gaza to Israel's actions in Jerusalem. And I cannot emphasize enough how that also changes the equation. Israel will now have to consider that whatever it does to Palestinians anywhere could result in, 6 million Israelis being in bomb shelters for a week, at least.
Yeah, John, what's the significance also of the concurrent resumption of activities that were announced by some of the West Bank military factions, factions that have been dormant for years, especially as the PA had worked in conjunction with Israel to, quash any sort of resistance activities?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting development. Like when we're talking ceasefires, can Hamas agree to a ceasefire while Islamic Jihad and the Al-Aqsa Martyrs Brigades are in gunfights in the West Bank? Or more to the point, the guns came out in the West Bank in the last 2 days because Israel started killing people with live ammunition. And so those are considerations that go into any ceasefire now. And the legitimacy of the resistance is what will hold a ceasefire for Palestinians. In the way that Israeli commentators can't understand why Abbas couldn't just secure Jerusalem, right? You have to have somebody who's got legitimacy on the ground in the population in question to hand out orders like a ceasefire in the middle of a war where your families are being massacred. Just one thing about the rockets. The rockets are not, the rockets are a product of the environment, right? They walled off these people in the ghetto that they can't get out. They don't give them any kind of pass system to get in and out, basically at all. Making standoff weaponry was going to be obviously something that they would do. It's not necessarily that it's a tactic that, that you would pick in any situation, but to have it in the Gaza Strip just makes perfect logical sense. And that's where the question of the West Bank resistance comes in, because we haven't seen yet resistance on this level, armed struggle, popular protest on this level in the West Bank since they walled off the West Bank. So it's not entirely clear to me how the next intifada in the West Bank unfolds when people are in 16 mini ghettos, mini Gazas around the West Bank. Is that fighting going to be through the PA? Is Israel going to come into the West Bank ghettos to fight? There's a lot of questions that are questions that the Israelis don't want to answer. And that's the same thing I would say about the ground invasion. Ask an Israeli soldier who fought in 2014 if he wants to be at the front of the line to go into Gaza. They have a conscripted army, right? They're calling up reserves. They're saying one of their original bluster was they're calling up reserves, 9,000 reserves. People who are school teachers from Monday to Friday, that's who they're calling up. Are those people going to want to be the first to go into Gaza? There are strategic things that have changed for the Israeli army. Is the Israeli army going to go into Lebanon? I mean, the same thing happened in Lebanon in 2006. They tried a ground invasion. They came up the hill and were stopped in their tracks, turned around, went back down, and then they, if you will remember, shelled and cluster bombed all those areas that they couldn't go in on the ground to. So there's history with this. There's always history with this.
And remember, just I think yesterday as we're speaking, Netanyahu summoned all the foreign ambassadors to an auditorium in order to justify this massacre that's going on in Gaza. And he actually said, there's two strategies with Gaza. One is deterrence, which is what we're doing now, which means kill men, women, and children until the natives get it into their heads that there's no point resisting. And the other is conquering Gaza. And he said that's not off the table. So that was reported as, a threat to launch a ground invasion. But to me, that came off precisely, as you said, John, as bluster and desperation, because Israel is unable to achieve what it wants to achieve, which is, the defeat and submission of the Palestinians through this bombardment. And earlier, when Israel had threatened a ground invasion or made motions towards a ground invasion, like moving troops around Gaza or authorizing the pull-up of reserves, the Qassam brigades actually made a statement, and I think Sarai al-Quds, the Islamic Jihad's military wing, made a similar statement saying, come on, do it. I think Qassam said, you invading Gaza is our shortest route to victory. And I think it's very significant that there are no serious demands in Israel, even from the far right. Yeah, of course, there are the far right people who say flatten Gaza, level Gaza, but there are really no credible calls from anyone in Israel for a ground operation in Gaza.
There would be a mutiny. The army is not going in and fighting in a dense urban environment that has got a subway system of tunnels under it. And I don't see it. I mean, we could always be proven wrong within an hour of making these kind of statements, but I don't see a ground invasion as a possibility. And I mean, I think we can all hope for not having a ground invasion, as it's a very costly thing. But the strategic dynamic has changed in the Israel-Palestine conflict, and it's changed in the Israel-Hezbollah conflict. And those are factors that are real on the ground that just don't really get captured by the Twitter debates or the New York Times republishing Israeli sources. There's a dynamic around Israel that Israel knows.
And if you consider the extent of the disruption to Israel, there have been reports in the Israeli media that the psychological helplines can't cope with the demand, and there was a member of the Knesset who said we have to provide emergency funding for psychological help because the Israeli population is collectively having a nervous breakdown from what they're going through, which is, I'm not going to say it's not frightening for people to be in this situation. It's of course a tiny fraction of what Palestinians in Gaza put through all the time, not even just now when the heavy bombing is going. But I think Israelis know that what they're facing now from Gaza is still a fraction of what would happen.
Or a full-scale conflict with Hamas. I mean, they've been developing for 7 years since the last one, Islamic Jihad and Hamas and the Joint Operations Room. I mean, there's all kinds of capabilities that we know they have that we haven't seen as much of. We know that they have drones, suicide drones capable. They have autonomous submarines that we know about. They have the entire Frogman unit that we haven't heard anything about, in part because Israel's left their bases all around. They've left them open. They used to just sit like a massive parking lot. Outside of Gaza used to look like a used car parking lot for tanks. They would all muster there. And now they're not there at all. And the footage from the first day when they were doing all of the things that they normally do when one of these flare-ups starts, the first thing you see in Israel is truck after truck, flatbed truck carrying tanks down to the border. Well, the tank didn't even get unloaded off the truck, and it got hit by a Hornet. The pictures of it on the back of the truck smoking. And that was the last of their input of the normally dozens and dozens of tanks that they put in the ground. There's lots of little clues that Israel's offering that they don't want the conflict. And where, the poking of the holes in the tunnels that they've been doing, the nature of a tunnel is that it has many entrances all through it. That's the potency of the tunnel. It's not just a straight line. And so when you poke a spike on the border and you cut through a tunnel, and that somebody has dug with a hand trowel at great personal effect, those tunnels, you can't, those tunnels could be rebuilt around the spike that goes in and interrupts quite easily by just doing a little detour around it. And you keep the exact, the Israelis are calling it a metro. In Canada, we call it a subway. But if you're talking about a massive system under the ground, pinpricking one part of that system isn't ruining the system. And maybe the border ability for them to come out and grab soldiers on the border is limited. But a ground war, the tunnels are under the entire ground war. I just don't see it happening.
I can...
Oh, what do you think? Interesting information. Any comments? So Mohammed, welcome. Any comments anybody has?
There's no way Israel is going to take a chance to enter the foot into Gaza. They know what's going to happen. They're going to be landmined and they're going to get themselves blown out of hell. I hear about Hamas. Nothing about the Stern, nothing about the Irgun, who were both terrorist group. And then a little later on, you put a suit and a tie and they call themselves politician. It's the same bullshit all around anyway. No, you're right. No.
Else have any comment?
Yeah, I mean, there's also a great fear of soldiers being kidnapped, obviously, isn't there? So they don't want to risk that at all. Extremely unpopular.
One of the fights going on in the Knesset was that the guy in Gaza, there was 2 bodies of 2 Israeli soldiers that Hamas returned, and the right is pissed off that they had a ceasefire without demanding the return of those 2 soldiers, but they didn't.
Couldn't hear that very well.
All right, let me try again. That the Israeli right is annoyed at that the ceasefire was agreed to without demanding the return of 2 Israeli soldiers, bodies that 2 Israeli soldiers that are in Gaza.
Oh,
and they wanted that to be part of the ceasefire agreement, but it wasn't.
Oh, I didn't hear that. Is that since 2014, you mean?
Yes, right.
The
So
bodies in there since 2014.
they're under attack. So the Netanyahu is under attack for not insisting on those returns.
I'd just like to say something about this policy of deterrence, because it's been clear since World War II that that doesn't work, that it only strengthens resistance. My grandfather died, flying back from bombing Mannheim, and if he'd lived, he could have gone on to bomb Dresden. Well, it didn't break anyone's nerve, So it's just a lie, really, because surely that would be the first thing you would learn at any kind of level, in the military, that doesn't work.
Yeah.
So it's just so cynical. I think the word cynical keeps coming back and back. I see it to me. I just see it in so many arguments of people who, would never themselves, probably even, aren't Israelis. They're sort of sitting on the sidelines but defending Israel with very, very cynical arguments. That is the largest one, really, because it just causes,
Israel-Palestine.
Pardon, Mohammed, what did you say? Mohammed, we didn't hear what you said. I think you muted yourself or unmuted. What I found interesting is his discussion of all the different factions, resistance factions in Palestine.
Why does it sound so bad?
Pardon?
Eh?
What?
Why does it sound so bad? Like there's a wind on the speaker or something?
You know why? Because I'm next to my window. There is a wind on the speakers. Yeah, I'm next to my window on the Hudson River, and it's very windy. So I apologize for that. All right. Well, so if you, it's past our time, but there's another 15 minutes, 10 minutes or so left on this. So I'm going to play it for interest. Those of you who are interested in hearing the rest of this video. Otherwise,
Jackie, before we start, I got to go. Preparing for another interview, and this one's in Arabic and English. The 30th at 1 o'clock, we're having a demonstration in solidarity with Palestine at Washington Square. I just wanted to make that announcement. Downtown Manhattan at 1 o'clock, the 30th, that's Sunday, next Sunday. We're having a demonstration that will last maybe an hour or two, and you're all welcome to join us. And we'll be more about that.
What I might do, Frank, is do Zoom Palestine from it.
Yeah, and I think that's definitely possible.
From the demonstration, that could be good.
Absolutely.
So we'll talk more. I sent you a message.
Great.
Help you with it, so I don't know if you saw it, but anyhow.
Yeah, we'll get together next week. Anyway, thank you, everybody. I've got to go.
All right, I'm going to play the rest of this because it's got so much interesting information in it. Okay.
Confirm from my own experience, when I went to Gaza in 2013, the only time I've been able to go to Gaza, we were able to go and visit tunnels on the Rafah border. Now, these were commercial tunnels. They weren't military tunnels, obviously, but we still required, these are not just open for anyone to go to. And we weren't allowed to take pictures. I was with other journalists and people in Gaza. And it was incredible because we were taken to one of the large tunnels that was like, you have to imagine a very wide, a vertical circular shaft with a platform, a lift platform. And at the ground level, you go onto the platform, and this is a circular platform that you could park two cars on side by side. And then it was like incredibly engineered. There was like rails down the vertical shaft of the tunnel. And then, they pressed the button. There was a warning horn, so that, a safety horn, so that people would be away from the edges where the moving parts are. And then we went down on this platform. I don't know exactly how far we went down, but when you looked up, like the sky was just a little hole. And then there was a horizontal tunnel, which would have been going straight through to Egypt. And that horizontal tunnel was just big enough to drive a car through. It's not like a traffic tunnel size, but you could drive a car through it. And it had lighting all the way, and it had bracing. So, I think there was steel in that particular tunnel. There was like steel bracing, and there was electricity running along it with lighting. We walked a certain distance into it, obviously not all the way to Egypt, but it was astounding. If you had told me about this, I'd heard stories about it, but I thought these were sort of fanciful stories. I would not have entirely believed it unless I'd seen it with my own eyes. It was incredible. But that was a commercial tunnel. Now you have to imagine what is under the whole Gaza Strip and deep under the whole Gaza Strip. In other words, I'm not a military strategist, but I can't imagine that you would put your most valuable assets right at the edge of the Gaza Strip. You're going to put that stuff, deep under Gaza and deep into Gaza. But what it told me, what I can infer from that is that there is a capability in Gaza to build very significant underground structures and assets that Israel will never be able to reach.
And it's true, and that's what they're doing. And they got it from Hezbollah in 2006 that did that too. It was not just that they had tunnels to access Israeli troops, it's that they had tunnels to protect their own troops, that they had barracks underneath there, so troops could never come, didn't have to come up. They have meeting rooms, and it's the capacity and the directions and the understanding of the landscape from underneath. It just turns everything that Israel thought that it was doing with its like geospatial stuff, just turns it on its head, right? They know where every building is, they know where every floor is, but there's this thing underneath the ground that I just think it prevents, like when they're training, can you imagine training for those tunnel operations? Like, it's your turn, like you go down, check and see where it ends. Like there's no good way of doing it. And on the other hand, the Palestinians have the subway map. They know where they can go to access everything at any moment when any attack comes in on the border. I just think that the strategic calculus has changed too much. And yeah, and like what you were saying about the summer holidays, Ali, is super important, because it's very important for Israel to have this tourism industry. It's very important for Israel to have this be to not be interrupted. And so what they did was after the 2014 war, where they couldn't have planes land, they've been working on their airport at Eilat to make it an international airport so that you won't interrupt the flow. So then they did that, and when whatever day it was last week, Thursday or whatever, when the Israelis said that they were not flying planes, they were going to send them instead to Eilat. Qassam pulled out their longest range rocket, fired a 250-kilometer rocket that puts Eilat in range. That was there, like they didn't show at the beginning of the war, like, oh, look at all the tools that we have. The idea that we're hearing in the Israeli media that, like, oh, they knocked out entire Cornet anti-tank missile units, or that they're shutting down borders, there's very little evidence of that.
It's a very crude military disinformation, I think. I think
it is
more desperate.
And that airport, by the way, I've not been to it, but actually when you drive down, as I did was in 2019, down to Aqaba from Amman in Jordan, down the Dead Sea Road, you pass that airport because it's just on the other side of the border. And it looks like a terrible place to have an airport, because on one side, so on the west side are high mountains. There's high mountains. That Israel only has a narrow strip of flat land between the mountains and the Jordanian border. So on one side you have these high mountains, and on the other side you have the Jordanian border. So when you're driving down the road in Jordan, you're just looking across at the Israeli airport. And they've built these very high walls around the airport. It's very strange to think that of an airport, like, you probably want an airport to be unobstructed. But there are these very high walls around the airport I assume, to kind of to protect it from missile attacks or whatever. So it seems very, and I think it's named after, isn't it named after the Israeli astronaut who, I have to check that, but I think it's named after the Israeli astronaut who died on the Columbia space shuttle. But yeah, so it just doesn't seem very ideal to have the airport there, nor really a viable alternative to Ben Gurion Airport. And then, of course, if they tried to put one in the north, then you're well within the range of Lebanon. So I think it's fascinating to. We're not really used to thinking about Israel as I think for many years Israel did convince people that it is invincible and invulnerable. And what these conflagrations show us is really, it shows kind of the weaknesses, and the resistance in Gaza have nothing but time to study Israel's weaknesses.
Yeah.
Okay, everybody, thank you very much. We've gone a half hour over, but I think it was really interesting to hear this podcast. I learned a lot about the tunnels, and I'll be in Jordan this summer. I'll be doing the broadcast from Jordan. and I'll probably go to Jerusalem. And Richard, I'm coming to Lebanon. I have an open ticket for Lebanon, so I'll be in Lebanon.
Okay.
Oh, yeah. So
Okay.
thanks a lot for your participation. Now, I'm waiting to hear from Adamir about their we think it's going to be June 6th, but that's also the date for our poetry slam, which is the first Sunday. So I'll keep you posted on what what will come up next. We have next week, June 30th, which is open if anybody has any suggestions for a program.
I've got a suggestion.
Yeah, okay, great, Naomi.
Okay, so I have a colleague, a Facebook friend and colleague in Gaza. His name is Mosab Abu Toha, and he is a poet and writer. He founded the Edward Said Library. It's a lending library and bookshop, English language. I think it's the only English language library in Gaza.
Was that the one that was destroyed? It was a library destroyed.
He didn't say. I haven't seen that on his post yet, so I hope that's not happened. But basically, he's been extremely active on Facebook and also in the world media. So he's been interviewed by the BBC several times on the radio and television, and also on Channel 4, and also in the Times. So he's become a spokesperson, and he's also a very lovely poet, So I think he would be a really good guest.
That would be great.
I would really like to get him together with Frank, because he's been documenting a lot from his window. He's been taking a lot of videos from his window, which might be useful evidence.
Well, could you ask him if he'd be available next Sunday?
Yeah, I will email you both and CC you in. Yeah.
That'd be great, great. Okay, Naomi, thanks so much. And Richard, stay safe. And
nice to meet you, Richard. Nice to meet you.
You all keep the faith.
Yeah.
Stay here, no problem.
Bye bye.
No problem.
Bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.